My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host for this edition of State of the State. Our guest is Representative Jason Knight, a Democrat from District 67, which covers part of Barrington and part of Warren. He's been a member since 2016. Welcome to State of the State.
Thank you for having me.
I should say, yes.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to open with having you respond, if you wish, to some of the rumors I've heard, several different variations of what your next ideas are with respect to office. One rumor was that you're running for Attorney General, and then you have to, in that case, be in, I guess, a primary with Bob Craven, who's the chairman of the Judiciary. You're seeking a judgeship. You're looking to replace the Speaker of the House if he should choose to move on to another. You're laughing.
That's definitely not true, that one.
Okay. How about the other one of the other two? Are they all?
Candidly, I'm looking for my next step. I'm looking hard at an AG's race. I think I'm uniquely qualified for that, and I expect to have an announcement on that issue next month. Look
forward to it. When you come back as a candidate, maybe we'll have you and Representative Craven come on for a little discussion.
Well, we'll see what happens.
Okay. One of the things that we've been on hiatus all summer, as you know, and it seems that in the news reporting, Rhode Island is moving from crisis to crisis. They keep talking about things, the housing crisis, the climate crisis, the education crisis, the fiscal crisis, and so forth. And I guess, why does Rhode Island seem to be lurching from crisis to crisis rather than being proactive and so these things don't become a crisis?
Well, I would tell you, I hear what you're saying, but I kind of disagree with the formulation, because a lot of people talk about the housing crisis, this, that, and the other thing. Our problems are just like everybody else's problems. We have, we're an imperfect system, and we have problems that are, that seem to be around all the time that we have to, it's our obligation to work on and work hard on. Housing is the issue of the moment because we've had real problems, particularly when the weather turns bad, of finding places to put our, finding roofs and shelter for folks who are on the street during those cold winters. And that is a big deal, and it absolutely requires our top of mind attention. But housing has been an issue in Rhode Island for ages. Mm-hmm. I think that you're seeing new attention paid to it because that's where our attention is focused. But I challenge you to find any state in the union that doesn't have some homeless issues, it doesn't have issues around energy production and climate change and costs, especially costs these days coming off the pandemic and with the inflation that we're all battling here in the country. We all have problems. Those problems need to be worked on all the time.
Prior to COVID, the state budget was just under $10 billion. And then what I call COVID cash began to pour in. We got a lot of money, and the budget went up to $14 billion. And it's staying there. The new budget that has been approved is just around $14 billion. Population really hasn't changed that much. And I guess I'm wondering why spending can't be more controlled. We got this money in, we seem to be able to go up 40%, which is way higher than the rate of inflation, and yet when the COVID crisis goes by, we still stay at $14 billion, and I don't know how that's sustainable in Rhode Island.
Well, I think that the budget numbers you're talking about, as soon as you start to break them down, it changes the story, because that's the narrative, right? All of a sudden, Rhode Island's budget is this huge thing, and something must have radically changed, that we're taking in all this money. Where's it coming from? And a lot of people have concerns about that. But when you break the budget down, you'll see that the portion that is actually taken from taxpayers here in Rhode Island has stayed relatively steady through the years. Rhode Island's budget is a little bit like the snake with the egg. We got all this COVID money that came in. Just because it came in 1 year doesn't mean it was spent in that year. It gets spent in the 2 or 3 to 4 to 5 out years from the time the budget is passed. And I think you're seeing in our budget these days some of the remnants of the COVID money. I remember 1 year we took I think it was about $100 million and used it to reinforce the unemployment insurance fund, right? Which is a good thing. It was socking money away for the future. It was making sure that our businesses weren't super hard hit by unemployment issues going forward. It's still reflected in a big, in the budget. And so everyone looks at the budget top line and has something to say about it. But if you're really going to talk about the budget, you got to talk about what's in the budget. We have passed responsible budgets with the money that we've had. Every year that I've been in the General Assembly, certainly since Speaker Shekarchi has been there, to make sure that our people are taken care of and make sure that we are covering Rhode Island's needs responsibly.
That's very interesting. You say the money wasn't spent all at once, and that's certainly true. In fact, it almost seems like some recipient of this money, especially school systems, are beginning to throw it at ridiculous things. And I have the impression that the special interest groups and activist groups and so forth who have come forward and were given this money, which was supposedly in response to a health epidemic, now they seem to say, well, I've got to have this money, and the state is responding by keeping the budget as high as it is. Yes, the money came in, now the money is no longer coming in. So where's the difference going to come up? It's got to come from the taxpayers.
Well, like I said, the money coming from individual taxpayers here in Rhode Island is relatively constant. We've had no new broad-based taxes over the last few years. We've actually had a tax cut. We got rid of the car tax. We did a significant cut to the tangible property tax for businesses. We have worked very hard to keep the amount of money coming directly from Rhode Islanders steady. The surpluses have come from the federal government. And so going back to your question, certainly there's going to be a lot of people every year who, have come to rely on government spending in somehow, some way. They're going to come with their hand out. That's why it's incumbent upon the General Assembly to pass the responsible budgets. And you can't, just because the way the programs are structured, it's very difficult to come from a high number, and then you can't just go in and chop and slash and whatnot. And again, I'm no budget expert. I don't sit on the Finance Committee. When it does come up for a vote, I spend a very concentrated amount of time studying the budget and making sure that whatever the Finance Committee did, I think it's a good idea, so I can vote yes or no on it. But I'll say that we work hard to pass those responsible budgets, and we've done that every year. As the future goes on and things change, particularly with what's coming down or not coming from the federal side, the budgets will change. And I'll trust the House and the Speaker to write a responsible, balanced budget just like they do every year.
Governor McKee has declared a new crisis called the health insurance crisis because rates are increasing. And he's actually directed the state health insurance commissioner. The only one other state has such a position. We have an office that's dedicated to health insurance, to look into the matter and talk to the hospital executives and see what can be done. But hospitals are losing millions of dollars. Doctors are retiring, and new primary care physicians and specialists now cannot be attracted. We seem to need more and more RNs and CNAs and all the health skilled professions. We have to pay these people more money to keep them and attract them. That's the reason the health costs that have to be reimbursed are going up. And certainly it's worth looking into it, but it just seems to me that this is another example of a crisis and racing around now to try to address a price increase that's going to happen across the board. And I don't know how many people realize that Medicare is going to change this year, and some people are going to have to make some decisions about their next year's choice of insurance. Am I being overstating this, or do you think there is such a thing?
No, I think we could do a show on the health insurance situation in the state of Rhode Island and in the country in general. We could be on the air for 2 days solid, right? It's such a complicated issue. Mm-hmm. Rhode Island, no doubt, has had a primary care doctor problem for a while now, and that's because our Medicaid funding, the program that covers, people who can't buy their own insurance,
Right.
and the social safety net program for us, it hasn't kept up with spending, or it hasn't kept up with the needs of the healthcare industry, because they only have a few payers, right? They have private insurance, they have Medicare, and they have Medicaid. Right. And so Rhode Island has not kept up, and in the last year's budget that we were just talking about, we brought the level of reimbursement for primary care doctors from a very small percentage of what Medicare pays out to 100% parity across the board in an attempt to address this crisis. We're also looking at the idea of whether or not Rhode Island needs its own medical school with its own in-state tuition to attract and retain our own people to become doctors and try to address that doctor shortage. So while the General Assembly, which is where I live, can't wave its hand and magically fix everything with the business of healthcare here in the state of Rhode Island, because it's a problem everywhere here in our country, we certainly took steps to address the primary care doctor shortage, and I think you'll see those steps yield results pretty soon. In other words, I'm not hearing about practices moving out of state anymore since we did that.
I have, so we don't have to get into whether or not it's real, because I know that when they advertise especially primary care, but now even some specialists that I've talked to that are closing up are saying, I'm just tired of it. In fact, I know one specialist who sold his practice and now works as a consultant, if you will, to a medical hospital group in Massachusetts. And he works basically from home, because he consults on that basis. He says, I'm making more money now than when I had an office in Rhode Island, because the rates are so much higher. But let me be clear. We had Governor McKee on prior to our hiatus, and I brought this question up to him long before this hit the papers. And I pointed out to him that when Medicaid was passed in 1965, and this is the problem that you're referring to, the population in the United States was about 190 million. Rhode Island's was just under 1 million. And the formula is that Medicaid, is divided up. It's a state-run program funded by the federal government. It's divided up as a population basis. The population today is about 330 million, and we're at 1.1 million. So what's happening is our piece of the pie and the federal level is shrinking, because our population isn't keeping pace with the growth of the population of the country. So I said, well, why don't they fix it? And my expert that I spoke to said, well, the problem is if you turn to New York, California, these states, Texas, and say to them, well, you got to give up some of your money, they're going to say, why? Our population is growing. It's not our problem that Rhode Island is stagnant. And so, you're correct, the population is aging, and they demand more services, and we don't get the funding at that level. The state has to accept that and step in, I think, with assistance, or we're going to keep losing doctors.
Well, as I said before, we have an Office of Health Commissioner, which I understand actually is a good thing for us. It's not an additional layer of administrative oversight.
It's been a long time.
It provides a coordinating action between all these payers that we talked about. And again, I am no health insurance expert. That is not my field. But the fact of the matter is that the strength of Medicaid is primarily a federal issue, right? There's 1,001 things that Congress could do to make Medicare and, frankly, Medicaid more robust, more efficient, cover more people, cover more problems. They just have refused to do it because of political reasons that are in D.C. They're not here. When Rhode Island is eligible for money, it would be irresponsible not to take the money. Right. So we take the money to provide for those who need the services here from Medicaid. And we do what we can to make that money go as far as it can. And I would argue that in the last few years, because we've tried some experimentation with Medicaid under different governors, we've gotten behind the curve in terms of reimbursements, and that's why you're seeing the problems with the doctors and the practices nowadays, which we can come back from, and the General Assembly just this past June took the first very significant step to do that. The Democratic majority saw that there was a problem and took immediate concrete steps to help fix that problem that I think is going to go a long way as we go in the future. Now, we're still going to have problems in healthcare. Don't get me wrong. America spends so much money on healthcare and arguably doesn't get the results that it really spends for nationally, right? So it's a big national problem that needs to be taken care of in D.C.
I have several other things. We're about halfway through the program, and what I want to talk about is the bill that you introduced in the last session, which is known as the assault weapon ban, or goes by other names. This is what I call the holy grail of the gun control folks that for many years have talked about it. You succeeded in introducing it and passing. It goes into effect July 1st of next year.
Yes.
And it prohibits the sale, manufacture, distribution, and transfer of so-called military-style firearms that have certain characteristics that are defined in the law. I've listened to attorneys across the country that specialize in criminal defense, particularly firearms-related crimes, and this is being described as a prototype for gun control legislation across the country because it does not ban the possession of these firearms that are owned if you own it before July 1st next year. However, when you pass away, you can't give it to anyone else. It either has to be turned into the police for destruction or sold to somebody out of state, and you can't do that unless you go through a FFL, Federal Licensed Dealer. So they're pointing this out, and one of the attorneys said that the hope of the supporters of this legislation is to slow the spread of these guns without triggering a direct constitutional challenge. Isn't this, notwithstanding the intent to improve public safety, isn't this really an infringement on a constitutional right when you come right down to it? Little by little, states seem to be moving, some states are moving in that direction.
I 100% disagree with you. So listen, I know that there's people out there who dedicate their entire lives towards improving gun safety across the United States. I am one state legislator here in Rhode Island, elected 5 times in a row to represent parts of Barrington and parts of Warren at the General Assembly. And what I know is that America has a gun safety problem, and I do not want to see it come here to Rhode Island, which is why I introduced that bill, pressed for its passage, and succeeded in getting its passage across the line and signed by the governor this past summer. I have no larger agenda about chipping away at the Second Amendment or somehow doing away with guns here in the country. My goal in life is to prevent, or is to make it harder for someone, the wrong people, to put their hands on an assault weapon here in Rhode Island, which is what the bill does. When it comes to constitutionality, you can still have, I disagree with you, you can still have a pistol, you can still have a long gun, you can still have a shotgun, because when you get down into the weeds, the assault weapons ban that we passed last summer still makes these kinds of weapons that are useful in home defense and self-defense situations widely available, just like they've always been. So people are more than free to exercise their constitutional right to bear arms by purchasing one of those types of weapons. I view it like this. When you have an assault-style weapon, it is kind of the equivalent. It has capabilities that are over and above what one might need, as we look at the data, for protecting their home and protecting their property. And without getting too much into the weeds, I think that we struck the right balance in this bill to outlaw the sales, right? So that eventually, over time, those weapons that currently exist here in Rhode Island will slowly come out of the closet through attrition and whatnot, and it will be harder and harder and harder to put your hands on one here in Rhode Island, particularly given the fact that Rhode Island is sandwiched in between Massachusetts and Connecticut, each of which has a long-standing assault weapons ban.
True. And there was an assault weapons ban in Connecticut when the Newtown school tragedy occurred. But that was a legally owned assault rifle, if you want to call it that. Massachusetts, when you were on the show the last time you and I mentioned this, or I mentioned it, when they passed their revision of their assault weapon ban, there were members of the Massachusetts legislature who said, we know this is unconstitutional, but we don't care because it's going to take 5 or 6 years to get to the Supreme Court. And there are the Ninth Circuit in California, which is certainly it's on the West Coast. California had certain of their laws have been struck down by the appeals court as being unconstitutional. There's other states where there seems to be a difference of opinions on the bench, and I guess it's going to be settled at the Supreme Court level. I mean, you and I could discuss it. People can talk about it on the street or at the gun club or wherever they want, and it's not going to change anything until the Supreme Court makes it clear what the issue is, I think. And I tend to agree with you, but I don't think it's a safety problem because assault weapons are not being used in Rhode Island to commit crimes.
You're right, they aren't.
Right.
And the goal is to make sure that, God forbid, it never happens.
Well, by far, handguns are more used in any of the crimes that you want to talk about in Rhode Island. And what are we going to do about them?
Well, I think the Constitution's clear that if you try to get rid of handguns, that would be over the top, right? When we look at the jurisprudence that comes down from the Supreme Court, I think that a handgun ban of some kind, and I'm not suggesting we put one forward, but for the sake of argument, if one ever existed, I don't think that there's a judge in the land that would hesitate to strike down that law instantly, because it seems to me, at first blush, to be a huge violation of the Second Amendment, because it is that is the weapon that's been in use forever and a day, right? Pistols and revolvers and that sort of thing.
And they
lack all the sort of dangerousness characteristics that other weapons have, other weapons that have been banned, like explosives and bombs and machine guns and now assault rifles.
Okay, so I want to talk a minute about the Washington Bridge, what I call fiasco, which you're certainly familiar with coming over from East Bay every day.
It is. There are other words for it, Richard.
I'm sure there are. I don't have to do that very often, but I understand. I don't understand. This has been really mishandled. Most people look at this, and not the fact that the bridge had deteriorated, but the fact that the whole recovery of the use of bridge seems to be bumbled. And I don't understand why Director Peter Alviti of DOT seems to be coated with Teflon on this. I remember when this whole thing started, he was being interviewed, and the reporter, the interviewer, was asking him, he kept saying the same thing over and over again. I'm an engineer, I know how to design bridges. The Providence Journal published a letter I sent to him, and I said, Director Alviti, you may be an engineer, but you're director of a public agency. Your salary is paid by the public. You report to the governor, you serve at his pleasure, but you can't just dodge the issue. Doesn't the buck stop with him at some point? Well,
the buck stops with the governor.
Yes.
I mean, I represent an East Bay community which was drastically affected by this bridge closure. And you see that the bridge closure and the efforts to move the traffic over to one side and the other has created just enormous problems in getting around here in Rhode Island. Never mind, the East Bay has its own particular issues, and the impact over there was very, very severe, particularly East Providence, particularly Barrington, particularly Warren. But the bridge closure just affects things statewide. Some days I come away and I see traffic, I drive across on one side, and I'm driving down 95 South, and I see the backup because of the bridge all the way down to the canyon and sometimes even beyond. And it's awful. Think of the wasted productivity time of the entire state because that bridge failed. So I think the fact that the bridge failed in the first place is a terrible failure of government. I'm frustrated we haven't seen one lick of accountability out of this administration. I mean, not one lick of accountability out of this administration ever. I'm frustrated with the response. I'm frustrated with the fact that the bridge failed in the first place. And I just like you, and I think just like every other voter out there, would like to see some accountability to know, why do we get into this boat? How can we make sure that it doesn't happen again? And who is going to be accountable for the failures in government that led us to this point?
Well, we agree on that for sure.
Right on.
And it's amazing to me that the way that potential structural failure was discovered was a young contract engineer who was there to look at the paint job noticed it, and luckily did, because it could have been a real tragedy.
Right? It could have been awful. We've seen that in other places in the country. I'm so thankful that when the problem became apparent, somebody decided to do the right thing and stop the traffic.
Yes.
To make sure that it was safe, because you can imagine situations where somebody would say, oh, we don't want to do this. No, they took decisive action. I appreciate that. I applaud that. They've taken action to improve the traffic situation as much as they can, given the working infrastructure that's available to them. I mean, 6 lanes of traffic across the existing bridges right now that works most of the time is better than having no bridge at all and no crossover at all, which we lived with for a little while. So that's great. But the time needed to get a real fix in, to get a replacement, the initial sort of botched bid process, the delays, and the hiding behind the lawsuit, I find terribly frustrating, and I don't know a voter in my district who doesn't feel the same way.
Well, I think, and also we keep our fingers crossed that the existing bridge that they're using, putting 6 lanes of traffic, one was designed for, 3? We got to keep our fingers crossed, and they are monitoring it, but boy.
Right. I don't have any concerns there. I think, they showed that they will do the right thing when safety is a concern. If it becomes an issue on that bridge, then I think they'll do the right thing. I absolutely don't want to suggest that they wouldn't. What I am here to say is that the accountability for that project is unacceptable. And the timeline that it's going to take to fix that, I understand things take time to build, but I think it could have been shorter.
I agree. And we're almost out of time, and I certainly want to thank you for coming back again. And we'll take you up when you make your final decision and announcement. I do hope that you'll come back, and if you're running for AG, you'll sit down and I can get Representative Craven to come, and that would be an interesting debate. And I want to thank you for your service in the General Assembly and your service in the Navy, which I just learned you were a 8-year submariner.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming to this edition of State of the State, and I hope you'll join us for future editions.